Max, welcome to the 101st interview series. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This is the first interview for those watching where Tommy and I are doing it together, so apologies in advance if we get in each other's way. We haven't rehearsed it, so we're going to freestyle it and see how we get on. Max has an incredible real-life experience. So when we go back to what we talk about the 101st, of using the power of incredible real-life experiences to drive change, Max's experience is every definition of incredible. So I won't go into the intro in too much detail because I'll be taking all the credit away from Max, but effectively Max's story is one of failure and then one of absolute triumphant success in the Atlantic Challenge race. So before we go into that, Max, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If you want to give everyone a little bit of an intro into you, who you are and what you're up to at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Look, guys, thanks a lot for having me. Great to be on this and be able to share the story and have a chat about my lessons and everything from my experience. And yeah, so at the moment, I've actually set up a company called Rogue Wave Scenarios, and I think that will become, the relevance of that will become more apparent as we talk, obviously today. But the idea is that it's a resilience consultancy. Focused on helping individuals, teams, and organizations to navigate radical uncertainty. And we do that through scenario planning workshops. So that's the basis of the business itself. And I set that up only about 4 months ago now, so just at the back end of 2020, and also set up in the middle of a pandemic, much like yourselves. So the sort of stuff that we're working on in terms of navigating these sort of uncertain times, obviously highly relevant, and yeah, that's where I'm at the moment, and looking forward to chatting more about that as we move forward.
Awesome. So the relevance of the name of your business, as you said, will become very clear as we go through the story. So let's dive in then, literally. So your experience, as we said at the start, is all about the Atlantic Challenge race, which you ended up doing twice. As we said, the first one, for want of a better word, failed, and the second one, for want of a better word, was a complete triumph. So if we kind of segment the story into kind of 3 bits, so the first race, the in-between, and then the second race. So we'll start with the first race. So can you just kind of give us that part of the journey, so the story? So why did you decide to take on this race across the Atlantic? What happened? And then we'll dive into the next bit.
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's probably best to think about my upbringing initially. I think that I was someone who probably thrived most on the sports field and in sports in general. I was like, would anything bat on a ball, I'd pick it up and play it. Loved all sorts of different sports. I swam, played tennis, rugby, cricket. I was, definitely someone that just really enjoyed those experiences, and I think it was kind of created some of those fundamental values and components that made me for sure, and certainly built a sort of base level of competitiveness that I think really certainly defined me growing up. And but I think that essence was lost when I moved on from school to university, and played much less sport, and just found myself losing my way a little bit, and certainly losing track a little bit of what my kind of fundamental character was, and some of my attributes and those things that I felt, as I said, were fundamental to who I was. So when I was in my kind of second or third year of university, I just made a decision to kind of have quite a radical lifestyle shift and try to focus back on that sort of competitiveness that I've been missing from my life for quite a long time. And the way that started to manifest itself was that I wanted to take on quite a significant challenge, and I wanted to find something which was, I guess, a physical and mental challenge that would have a high level of investment in terms of time and energy, and emotional, mental, physical commitments as well. And having done some very broad searches for quite a considerable period of time, I came across this race, as you mentioned there, Will, called the Telescopic Atlantic Challenge, and it was this 3,000-mile row across the Atlantic Ocean from the Canaries to Antigua. And it was estimated to take between 40 and 90 days. And you were completely self-sufficient on board this boat, rowing 24 hours a day for the duration. All of your food, all of your equipment was on board with you. And for me, looking at, the first photos I saw of this race were people standing on the finish line in Antigua with a flare above their heads, celebrating, what was clearly an unbelievably epic adventure and challenge. And for me, that kind of, I got that kind of finish line feeling of wow, that looks unbelievable, and I can't imagine what that might feel like, considering the journey that's needed to get to that point. So for me, at that point, I just felt like it was one of the toughest challenges I'd seen out there, and pretty much on the spot made a decision that I would go on to take this race, to take on this challenge and give it a go. So one thing probably to mention at this point is I had no sea experience at all, so no ocean faring experience. I also had never rowed, so an interesting combination of factors considering the challenge. But I think ultimately, what I was kind of looking for was a steep learning curve, and I wanted to see what I was capable of in a certain period of time, and I think I was excited by that prospect of the challenge. So having made a decision to take it on, I think the next thing was, who was I going to do it with? I made a decision that I'd do it with one other person in a pair, and to kind of cut through this pit a little bit quicker than I normally would. But I initially spoke to a friend of mine called Dave Spellman, and he came on board immediately. A very easy conversation. I remember actually texting my mum and saying, "You okay for me to row across the Atlantic?" That came back immediately with a no. So I immediately kind of pursued with the challenge. I gave Dave a call. I was like, right, I've got the green light from mum. Let's go. So anyway, I called Dave. We met up the next day and we said, yes. 6 months later, we had started to build the campaign and the training. Dave actually got a pro rugby contract, and that was a bit of a dream of his at that point. So very difficult decision, but we ended up diverging, and I ended up going to basically the only other person that I would be willing to take on this challenge with, confined to a boat for that amount of time. Small boat the list is not long. So I went to a friend of mine called Chris Williams, and he came on board, and we were then going to the start line together. We actually pitched for the 2016 race, December 2016, and just had a setback with our funding, which ended up having to push back the race 12 months for us, which wasn't easy in itself. But we did arrive at the start line in December 2017 in La Gomera, ready to go.
Okay. And did you feel ready? So you said you've never had any experience of being in the sea or rowing. So when you're on that start line, because obviously it was a lot of the Atlantic crossings and rows, we had spoken to another two lads who rowed the Atlantic as well, but in a different scenario. That wasn't a race. That was them kind of doing it solo. So I suppose the race gives it a very different dynamic, because there's a competitive element. You've got all these other guys, you're thinking, God, they've probably been doing this for years, or, so how did you and Chris feel at the start then, knowing, okay, we've literally given ourselves a set period of time, we're pretty new at this, and we're going to go against potentially professional rowers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a variety of experience levels, but I think that ultimately, there are certain boxes you've got to tick in terms of training, and in terms of learning, and all the different sort of qualifications that you might need. So we did tick those boxes. Obviously, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but it's that sense of getting to the start. As I said, I said we were ready. At the time we felt ready. We were incredibly excited. We had done what we felt we needed to do in terms of training, and so on the start line there was a buzz about it for sure. Certainly we weren't standing there feeling, really, to be honest with you, feeling concerned about many things. We were excited for what was ahead. Really had been a 2-year sort of venture for me, and about 18 months for Chris, and so all that effort that we had put in, it really is a sort of 24-hour 24/7 thing, trying to get to the start line. They do say that getting to the start line itself, with its challenges of having to raise close to £100,000 to train to get the qualifications, it's almost as difficult as the crossing itself. So to get there was a in our eyes was an achievement and accomplishment on its own. And I think at that point we did feel like we were ready, and in the discussions with people, you know, the other teams, etc. And as you say, there is that dynamic. This is a race, and I think that brings in kind of another aspect to why it was such a kind of enticing prospect for me personally, was that competitiveness. As I said, yes, I think that a lot of this was to do with being competitive with myself and that you versus you mentality. But then equally, I know I was aware of that sense that, okay, when you're actually trying to cross an ocean for a couple of months, to keep pulling on the oars, you need to have those push factors. And for me, I was sure that sense of a race and knowing there's a crew, you know, 100 miles that way rowing to get across as well is going to give me that sort of that extra boost that I would need to continue to move the boat forward.
And those push factors, did you and Chris sort of share what those were? You know, your drivers obviously as a team for each other, but almost did you have a series of, I don't know, words or things that you identified with when it did get difficult from a training point of view, and then for the race?
Yeah, great question, because I think that's certainly something that I think about a lot now. And actually, we'll talk about this, but with rogue wave scenarios, I'm doing a lot of scenario planning workshops with ocean racing crews. And I think one of the things that I'm so focused on now is that team dynamic, and also the team alignment on goals and ambitions. And I think that can vary so much between individuals. And I think so in answer to your question, I think me and Chris did have we did have considerable discussions about what we wanted to achieve. Maybe we didn't realize the importance of those discussions, but I think that yes, in the build-up we were certainly aligned on this idea that, you know, we wanted to maximize our performance. It wasn't just this sense of getting across. It was, you know, how hard can we push? What sort of training can we do to really maximize our performance out there? And certainly had our eyes on, you know, winning our category of the race. And in the back of your mind, there's always this sense of potential for records and world records and these things in the sport. So I think that's where where we were at that point. But on the so we got there kind of December 2017. And as I said, on the 14th of December was our start date, and we set off a couple of days later than planned, and that was due to some big weather systems that were coming through, some big winds and waves, and the race, like the conditions to be favourable for a couple of days from the race start to get the crews out of the Canaries in the first few days, so they don't get any teams sort of stuck in around the Canaries. So they actually delayed a couple of days because they said it was too kind of treacherous out there, which is kind of an interesting thing to be told a couple of days before you're about to start the race. But I think, you know, there was also a sense of, well, look, if it's fast and but yes, there is a bit of, you know, danger out there. That's what we're kind of expecting. So we wanted to get out there. We wanted to just attack it, and we got that chance on the 14th. So we set off, and basically the conditions hadn't really died down at all. And what happened in that first sort of week was just the most extreme sort of baptism of fire you can imagine going into a race like this, and immediately thrown into some really chaotic conditions, big seas, big winds, big waves, and getting thrown around on board the boat, thrown around in the cabin when we were trying to get an hour's sleep in. And it was really brutal. And I think that very quickly it became apparent. I think it's one of these things with a race like this, it's very difficult to actually imagine what it's like to be out there. Especially the thought, once you're out there for a day, you know, you're then facing the quickest way to finish this race is basically, or to kind of end this experience, is to keep pulling on the oars and going in one direction. You know, you're 40 days away from land, and incredible mental challenge to try and dissect that in the first few days. And I think we experienced all those kind of highs and lows that you would expect of kind of, wow, look at this, you know, the freedom of being out here and having this opportunity to take on this race. But then equally the deterioration physically and mentally was rapid. And I think that, you know, Chris had really bad seasickness. I didn't suffer as much, but he was vomiting pretty much every time he wasn't on the oars. And so our only real kind of way of maintaining some positivity on board was we also having power issues at this point. So we basically ended up just realizing that the one thing we could do was pull on the oars and continue to move the boat forward as quickly as we could. So we did that, and we focused on that being our most important thing. But all sorts of things we're dealing with: loss of appetite, sleep deprivation, probably getting 2 or 3 hours sleep a day, and then equally the sort of 12 to kind of 15, 16 hours of rowing a day. Was also that each of us was definitely taking its toll. And so we kind of came towards the back end of that week, and it is said that the first week is always one of the hardest because of that adaptation period. And we ended up getting to day 8 of the race, and every day were experiencing bigger waves, bigger seas, but they were moving us in the right direction. But it was, these really breathtaking waves, which are very hard, nothing like we had seen. But I think equally, we kind of thought, oh, this is what the Atlantic must be like. We've not been out here before. This must be what the experience is. Little did we know at that point that these were some of the most chaotic conditions that the race had seen in about a decade. So really kind of up against it, but certainly just kind of accepting that this was our reality now, and trying to do the best we could. So we got to this point on day 8 where we got up on the morning. Well, one of us woke up and the sun rose, and I came out on my shift. Chris was finishing his shift, and we actually kind of realized that there were some even bigger waves now on this morning, and we were starting to I guess accept that this was just a trend that was going to continue. And we ended up having a call with the race duty officer that morning, just to check in and see what was going on. And he kind of said to us, "Oh, look, you're covering some serious distances per day." And what was apparent actually was that we were sitting just ahead of the world record pace at this point, and we were also leading the race. So two things that weren't necessarily things that we thought were at all guaranteed, but with the good weather and our us pushing hard, we had managed to get to this point. And so that was a huge boost for us. We felt massively positive about it. And one of the things that also adds to the positivity in ocean rowing is surfing down waves. Quite a difficult thing to potentially imagine, but these kind of 7-meter 2x7 ocean rowing boats can catch these waves when they kind of break or half break in as they follow the following seas come towards you. And we would normally surf down a wave at maybe 5 or 6 knots, which is kind of double the speed you get when you're just moving along normally. So that was always, a lot of fun. But on that morning, we actually hit about 15 knots down a wave. And I think at that point, we kind of looked at each other and were like we haven't seen those speeds on the speedometer before. And I think at that point, we kind of knew that something had changed. And as we were continuing with our day, I remember this obviously, incredibly clearly. I think time is one of these things that really changes when you're out there doing a challenge like this. A minute can feel like an hour, but then a whole day can go in the blink of an eye, and it's interchanges all the time, and it's very disorientating. But this was one of those moments where everything was just, time basically stood still. And Chris was rowing at the time, and I was facing him on deck. And just a huge wave, rogue wave, basically from the side, so completely unusual angle and size out of nowhere, picked us up, turned us in the air, and then just slammed us upside down onto the water. And with this enormous impact. And we're obviously, a capsize of these things in ocean rowing where you prepare for them to happen, but also you can't really understand what that process is going to be like, what that event is going to then cause, all these things. And I think you look for 3 things probably. So are you knocked unconscious? So are you at all injured by the initial capsize? Then are you attached to the boat still? So have you become detached from the boat or not? And then thirdly, does the boat self-right? These boats are built to capsize and then self-right. And for us, those are the three things you look for, and for us, they happened sequentially, which was obviously great. Neither of us were knocked out. We both emerged from beneath the surface. I kind of gave a pull on my harness, which was still connected, likewise with Chris, and then we both saw the boat just self-right in front of us, and we kind of scrambled to kind of get back on board. But one of the things we were missing was our emergency beacon, which is the most important bit of life-saving equipment. And it's about the size of a sort of pint glass, for use of a better term, about this big. And it was basically floating away from the boat, a pretty decent speed. And we looked at it and we knew that if we couldn't recover it, our race was over. Because it's such an important piece of kit that the race won't let you continue if you lose one. And we made every effort to try and get it back without detaching ourselves from the boat, but it just wouldn't, it's so far away, it was about 10, 11 meters away. And I was still in the water at this point, and then suddenly it just turned and started making its way back to me, and it came all the way back into my outstretched hand, and I just kind of grabbed it, scrambled back on board, had a very big smile on my face, and just looked at Chris, and I was like, well, we got away with one there, popped it back in its fitting, and I think at this point we were ready to go again, and we kind of looked at each other, and I think that in hindsight there's this really interesting contrast between two guys that had never been at sea, well, not been at sea much, before we'd started this endeavor, never done any rowing, and now we were kind of going, we picked up a capsize and shrugged it off like you would if you had driven over a pothole down a local lane. So that was a weird sensation, but again, it's that adaptation piece of, this is the reality, this is what we're facing now. And we ended up getting back on board, and we were ready to go again, and pick up the oars. And so I turned to open up the cabin hatch, and immediately this huge plume of smoke, just thick toxic smoke, just hit me in the face, and I immediately shut the hatch, turned to Chris and just said fire, and basically the impact of the capsize was so great that it had dislodged our batteries that are used to power our communications and navigation equipment. And they had split and caught fire and completely decimated the cabin, destroyed all the comms and navigation equipment, and left this, what is our safe space, our protection from storms, our place to sleep, completely uninhabitable. And I grabbed a fire extinguisher and managed to extinguish the remaining flames. But now really there was this toxic mix of fire extinguisher residue and the fumes from the batteries. And at that point, we obviously, we took a step back and just realized that things had massively changed in our environment in that moment. And also at that moment, the conditions began to take a big dive and were getting a lot worse. So we were facing this position of safe space no longer available to us. And one thing we couldn't do was open up that hatch, clear it out, work out what was going on, and try and rectify the situation, because you cannot open up a hatch to the cabin in big seas, because if you capsize again, like we just had with a hatch open, you won't come back up and it won't self-right. So it's absolutely vital that stays shut. And we only had a couple of seconds between waves to actually have that hatch open. So we were facing obviously a pretty extraordinary decision, and really looking at our position and our ambitions and our goals. There was this immediate shift from a few seconds earlier, the goal, and for a period of 2 years, the goal had been to get to Antigua. And within a few seconds now, the goal was really survival. And to pivot that mindset from the former to the latter was obviously absolutely vital for everything we were trying to achieve in terms of safety moving forward, but also was incredibly difficult. And I think trying to release that sense of or accept the fact that our race was over was what a decision, well, an acceptance that needed to be made quickly, but also an incredibly hard one that was difficult to articulate. And but we did realize that we needed urgent assistance and that we weren't going to be able to recover this ourselves. And so we made made that decision that we needed to kind of communicate our some sort of support from externally, and we actually set off our repurb, and in amongst the rubble in between waves, we managed to grab a sat phone that was loose in the cabin, and it was working, and it had about 1 bar of battery left, and we managed to make a final call to the race organizers to tell them what had happened, and that we actually we required assistance, and we'd set off our repurb. And that was the kind of the final call that we made, and at that point we knew that it was just about, we were going to face a battle now to keep ourselves safe against what was incrementally more violent and chaotic conditions. So as we kind of got into the latter half of the day, we started to see some really extraordinary waves. Very difficult to try and actually envisage what those waves are like for people when you just say a number, but they were up to around 15 meters in height. And it is absolutely enormous if you kind of look at some of the comparisons of what that height looks like. These massive vertical walls of water just coming towards us one after the other. And really we just had to defend the boat was our priority, and we were both out on deck because we couldn't get in the cabin, and we basically devised this plan that would get us over the top of each wave without being pitch poled, which is an end over end capsize. And that was our big thing, was to stop another capsize in these conditions, because we knew it could be fatal. So we basically would throw ourselves against the cabin, rear cabin, at the top of each wave, with Chris first, and then I would throw myself into him, and our momentum would just knock the boat just over the top, and we'd almost get to a vertical position, then we'd do it again and throw ourselves against the cabin and knock ourselves over the top. And that kind of fight was something that we just did for hours and hours, right the way into the night, to just wave after wave, to just stop ourselves from being tipped upside down again. But as we entered so after kind of 8 or 9 hours of doing this, as we entered the early hours the kind of the late hours of the day, so as night started to fall, we knew we needed a different plan. We were no longer able to see those waves, and we needed to make a decision on what was next. And we did have a small storage cabin, which was about the size of a large suitcase inside. And we actually emptied it out and just realized that our only protection in the dark, when we couldn't see these waves coming, was going to be inside that cabin and not out on deck where we were vulnerable. So we both barricaded ourselves into this small cabin, and both in sort of, we're not small guys, we've both got a fetal position inside this cabin right next to each other, as cramped as you can imagine. And again, it was an interesting decision, because it was that relinquishing of the proactive fight, and in its place just this real sort of release of control, I guess, initially, to say, okay, we've done everything we can, we now need to kind of protect ourselves in throughout the night. And I think it's an interesting one, because at that point, I think, we were looking around like, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing extra we can add to our, potential for survival and rescue here. We had no idea when or if anyone was actually going to come to us. And if they did, what they would be like, essentially. So there's no way of understanding what that process might be and how long it might take. But we did make one really key decision, and it was the only thing we could do. And it was a decision to shine a laser flare, which is a very powerful laser, 360 degrees around the horizon, and do it at sort of regular intervals, every sort of 15, 20 minutes, to just say, for that hope that if there was someone appearing on the horizon, we'd get a chance to give them a signal. And it actually proved absolutely pivotal, in the experience and the events moving forward. But it was risky business as well, because we had to open up the cabin hatch briefly to do so, and these huge waves were kind of coming into onto the boat and across the boat, and you can actually hear them coming from, say, maybe 10 seconds out, and they'd whistle towards the boat, and then there'd just be this enormous impact. The whole boat would turn, and at times, because it was so dark, we had no idea if we were kind of upside down or the right way up, the way we were confined in the cabin. So I know we reflected on whether it was kind of the sense of being in a submarine during the war, with these sort of missiles approaching, like it really was that sort of feeling, if we, when we imagined it. So moving off forward from there, we kind of held on to that position for a number of hours into the night, and then faced a kind of the early hours of the morning. We did actually spot something on the horizon, and it was this white light, and we hadn't seen a single boat in 9 days now. So we were sure that this must be some sort of must be related to our rescue, and must be the boat that's come to do it. And there was a very naive sigh of relief. I think, you put yourselves in our shoes at that point. We've just seen a boat for the first time in 9 days, and I think in our heads we thought there could be this is one of those things where this boat's going to pull up, handbrake goes on, we jump on board, and suddenly we're safe. That was obviously super naive, because what was really about to unfold was a whole lot worse. And as we stepped out onto deck, as this vessel approached us, it became pretty apparent, what we were facing. And rather than a sort of classic rescue vessel, it was a 250 meter, 110,000 ton oil tanker. Again, scale seems to come up a lot in this story, but that's a really hard one to really understand. I don't know if anyone has any experience of spending time by an oil tanker, but it's, these things are colossal, and that's by no means that's quite a big tanker as well. So as it approached, it was completely breathtaking. And it was also unbelievably dangerous in its approach. It basically came straight towards us at about 6 knots. And so we step out on deck, and I remember coming out and just seeing this picture of these enormous front of this tanker just heading towards us, powering through the water, and just thinking, one, what the hell is it doing? And two, that's just going to crush us completely. But it ended up missing us by probably a couple of meters at the front. And so we ended up sliding down the side as it came past us. And we could see some heads kind of poking over the top from the deck. And it was the crew were kind of frantically scrambling around, screaming things at us that we couldn't understand. The waves were so loud, the wind was so loud, the tanker was so loud, everything, all those senses were on full throttle, and it was impossible to make some sort of communication that was positive or constructive. And they threw down a rope and a rope ladder, which were initially completely inaccessible in these conditions. And they're also just too high on the boat for us to reach. So they continued to move past us, and we were scraping down the side of this vessel. And we had this ridiculous situation of the tanker moving, pitching motion side to side in these big seas, trying to stop itself from being affected by the waves, and then these huge waves smashing us into the tanker. And we were right in the middle. It was very much an unstoppable force versus an immovable object, with this small ocean rowing boat and 2 blokes on there trying to survive, basically. And certainly it's not a fair fight by any stretch. So as we kind of worked our way to the back of the boat, we started to actually slide underneath the tanker and towards the propeller, which was turned off. But because of that curvature of the boat, its pitching motion was kind of dragging us underneath. And I really, clearly remember it like it was yesterday, just looking up and seeing this tanker just literally coming down on top of my head, and knowing that pretty much we were seconds away from being crushed. So Chris was at one end of the boat, and there was this very much this unspoken communication where his option had to be the rope because he was closest to that, and he grabbed hold of it, clipped his harness on to a buoy which was actually connected to that rope, and then swung off. And a couple of seconds later, my only option at this point was the rope ladder, which again was not lower enough for me to get onto it properly, but I managed to put one hand either side of that the bottom plank, and then swung off. And both of us were suddenly just hanging on the side of this tanker. A few seconds after that, our boat disappears straight underneath the tanker. That was the last time our boat ever gave any signal or was ever seen again. So it was absolutely the right decision. But, again, seconds really in it for that decision to be made. But it was the right one. And at this point, we were both hanging on the side of this tanker. But then we realized that there was another issue. They couldn't pull us up. We just weren't moving up the side of this tanker. And for some reason, they couldn't get us up the side and onto deck. So we were left hanging essentially in this position. And I was obviously hyper aware that I had no extra connection to this boat apart from my hands on this plank. And anyone that's done just hung from a bar or a rope for a considerable period of time, you can't last more than a few minutes really. And the plank certainly wasn't a good thing to be hanging off. So Chris fell after a few minutes, and actually tried to grab hold with his teeth, and they got sort of wrenched from his mouth, and he fell and was suspended above the water by the connection to the buoy. And a few seconds after that, I dropped and lost my grip and fell, but just obviously was aware and wasn't connected. So I fell straight into the water below. And I know that Chris talks about kind of looking down from his position on me falling into the water and just, really believing that he'd just seen his mate go. There's no chance of coming back from that position. And I emerged from beneath the surface of the water, and just, again, an image that will just stay with me so forever is this seeing Chris hanging on the side and the tanker just powering away at 6 knots, very much out of reach, and all hope with that of survival obviously diminishing by the second. And I think there's obviously a moment where you kind of consider what your fate's going to be in that position, but equally your instincts kick in, and it was good that I did have a heck of a survival instinct in that moment, because immediately for me it was the instinct was to swim, and I started swimming after this tanker. Again, a ludicrous position to be in, but just started to try and claw my way in the direction that this tanker was going, and as I did that for a few seconds, I then spotted something ahead of me, and it was what was to be my final lifeline, and it was a line that was just cutting through the water, and I could see it really clearly from the reflection on the top of the water, and immediately knew it was a rope, and it was a spare rope that was trailing out the back of the tanker that had been put out by the crew earlier on before the rescue. And basically with my last stroke with my right hand, I managed to grab the last 6 inches of this rope, and suddenly found myself just being dragged behind the tanker at 6 knots, just clinging on for my life. And as those moments kind of went on, I realized that my grip was already gone. I knew I'd be in serious trouble at that point. And so I tried to start clawing myself back towards the side of the boat. And at this point, one of the crew spotted me, and immediately, they started shouting and started trying to pull me back towards the side of the boat where the ladder was. And bit by bit, minute by minute, second by second, I got myself back up towards that ladder, and knew that I was facing a kind of, pretty significant leap of faith to get myself from that rope back to the ladder, separating myself from the tanker, basically what I'd hoped would be one final time. As I did that, I kind of just took a deep breath, 3, 2, 1, threw myself across, just when the water was coming high on the tanker, because a big wave came up, submerged the ladder. That was my opportunity. I got across, got my arms around, knew that I had to do more than just arms, so started to hook my legs in. And just as I felt like I wasn't quite secure, and any second that water level would drop and I'd be sucked out of the water, I managed to just get that last bit of energy to pull myself in, and just sat on this ladder like I was sitting on a swing. And the strangest thing was obviously perspectives at this point. Ours was so warped that as soon as I got into that position, I immediately was just like, again, sigh of relief, felt safe. And which is obviously out of context, makes no sense. That's not a safe position to be in on a swing on the side of a tanker in a storm in the Atlantic. But in that moment, compared to where I was a minute ago, I was safe. And what bit by bit, we were pulled up side by side, and dragged overboard, and pulled into a room where we kind of lay flat on our backs. Heart rate was 200 plus probably at this point, and completely polaxed. And we kind of looked at each other. We weren't really saying much, but we were looking for kind of confirmation of our well-being. And they dragged in the ship's doctor. Turned out to be a mechanic, who kind of came in and just said, "Oh yeah, you guys are okay. You're fine." Looking at us kind of on the floor of this room, but we were okay. We had survived. So that was basically where we finally were safe. And that tanker, as much as we wanted them to swing us around, take us back to the Canaries, it was bound for Brazil. And so we spent 3 weeks on the oil tanker with this crew heading to Brazil, where we did manage to end up getting back home.
So I have to say, in all these things we've done, I don't think we've probably spent as long not talking.
Yeah, so sorry about that.
No, that's not no, just because of the story, because we, you know, Tommy and I have, you've told us your story before, and that's why we want to get you on here, but hearing it again just kind of re-emphasizes how nuts it is, and it's amazing hearing you talk about it, because obviously, I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but you're able to talk about it very kind of pragmatically and succinctly now, but when you're hearing it, you kind of think, Christ, that's all insane. So if we go back over it then, before we kind of go into the next bit, and you take, there are 3 decisions that jump out at me that you and Chris made. So there was, and they progressively got more and more seriously kind of as. So the first one was the, when you're in the storm and then figuring out, right, we've got this, sorry, the first one was actually making a decision, right, the race is over, our race is done. So that first decision. The second one was then in the storm, when night's coming, you're going, okay, we can't keep doing this kind of hit the back of the boat, we've got to figure out how we're going to survive the night. Then the third one was then kind of this leap of faith of going, right, one of us is going to have to go for the boy, one of us is going to have to go for, and you kind of talk about them, as I say, very pragmatically, this is just what happened, the decision we had to make. In the moment, how were those decisions made? So was there any kind of actual conversation? If we go through them all, so the finishing the race, was there a conversation going, okay, actually, I think we could probably still go here? Like, we do this, we can still make it, or was it just, no, we're done?
Yeah, great questions. And yeah, as you say, you've identified some of those really key decisions there. And I think, yeah, there were conversations that were had on that first one. So in terms of the decision the decision, to really focus on the fact that our race was over now and we needed to shift focus and needed to put our energy into the kind of the safety and survival piece. That initial one absolutely was a discussion that we were having, but I think there was just this very coordinated assessment of what the dangers were that we were facing, and I think we were very calm in that, considering, in that position. No doubt, I remember the emotions of it. I remember how gutted we were when we had to look each other in the eyes and say, do we now accept that this is done? Do we now need to really think about how we can keep ourselves safe? Has this changed for us now? I remember those kind of, you always remember the looks you give each other more than the conversations and those images of being, of kind of the emotions on each other's faces. And I think, so we did exchange words on that, but I think it was that, as I said, that assessment of what the dangers were in those moments, how significant they were, and what the challenges were looking like in the short term. And I think that we really managed to do that, well. We were thinking very clearly about, one, what were the things that we could control, like what can we change about the position we're in right now, but then equally it was about what can we, what potentially can unfold if we're not careful. If we don't look after ourselves now and we start trying to think that this is still about getting to Antigua, how's that going to prevent some of these parts of this race, but which in the back of your mind always when you take on a challenge like this is the safety and the preservation of life. And I think that was the position we were in, and we did manage to kind of identify those things. I think the problem was it was a, for use of a better term here, it was a perfect storm of things that were happening in this moment. With the devastation of the cabin, the fact it had knocked out all our electricity, which would have given all sorts of other issues moving forward in the race, which would be so numerous they would have been very hard to overcome in general. But then the fact that it was a safe space that no longer could be utilized, and that protection, place to sleep, all these things, was now gone. But that, in combination with the current conditions that were deteriorating, we realized was the key factor here, was the fact that we were looking at probably at least 2 or 3 more days of these extraordinary conditions with no protection from our cabin, just trying to keep the boat upright. There was no way that we could spend time opening up that cabin and cleaning it out because of the danger of another capsize and the boat not self-righting. So without doubt, that first decision was made on those basis, I would say. And The second one that you mentioned, which was the decision to actually head into the cabin. Again, that one was also incredibly difficult because of that sense of I was actually I think I was probably against that at the time. Chris was the guy that was probably more for that decision. And so we did actually have some conflict there. And again, conflict is one of those things that any team deals with, but it can be, it's a positive in the right environment, but certainly something in those positions, it needs to be rectified pretty quickly. And so we had another discussion, and this is genuinely whilst we're throwing ourselves into the cabin, we're talking to each other about the pros and cons of going into the cabin, what could potentially happen if we stay out on deck. For me, I wanted to maintain as much control as possible, and even if it was going to be dark, I still had this sense of, my belief was that there would still be a control we could have outside on deck, maybe with a bit of moonlight or something, some sort of still, ability to still see these waves. But I then, it became pretty apparent that the right decision, for me, again, I discussed this with Chris over a few minutes, and we did decide that getting in there was going to be the right thing as darkness fell. And looking at the way that we were bashed around beyond that, without a doubt, was the right decision, because these waves were just crucifying the deck of the boat, just coming huge walls of water, and to be inside the cabin was definitely the right place to be. And to your final point there, Will, on the decision to part ways with the boat to actually, when we were facing with the tanker, another really interesting one, because I think one of the things that you do think about, and you're told, when I say told, you kind of learn is the most important thing about ocean rowing is never detach yourself from your boat, because you don't have, you've not got a motor, you've not got a sail, and with the currents and the way that the water moves in the Atlantic, if you part ways with a crew member, if they are separated from the boat, it's almost impossible to get back. And I think that's something that's always in your mind. Every time you come out on deck, you clip on immediately. If it's just the number one thing is always be clipped to the boat. So to make that decision to unclip had to be extraordinary circumstances. And I think there is this, you could argue we had no other option, but we did because there was no real guarantee of what was to come. And I think that there was this, as much as it might feel like there is a leap of faith moment where you only have one option, you've still got to take that option. And for us, that was, that was this decision to unclip and grab hold of what we could. And yeah, those, as I said, were not verbal. I don't remember those being verbal at all. They were these kind of these eye-to-eye communications from one end of the boat to the other, looking at what we were facing with the tanker, looking at where the ladder was on the rope, Chris having like one hand on the rope up his end, me being able to touch the ladder from mine. I think, we probably just said, and I don't know for sure because I can't recall these moments exactly, but I think there was just a vocal, we need to get off the boat, something like that. And Chris made a call his end, and I made the call my end, and the rest was, unfolded.
Unreal. Something that strikes me, and I've been thinking about it for a while since you've been going, is you guys did so much preparation. Obviously, two guys who hadn't spent a lot of time, on the water, and subsequently, I'm sure there's a hell of a lot of training involved. And you sort of get the sense of nothing can prepare you for what you went through. But I'm just curious whether do you think now, looking back and connecting the dots, there was anything that prepared you to sort of deal with that kind of life-changing decisions? You made decisions that you probably might never have thought about. But is there anything that you could connect with, and maybe you and Chris have discussed about what did sort of prepare you for that?
Yeah, I think that we did spend a lot of time training, whether it's the kind of the technical training or the physical training. We spent a lot of time just doing that stuff, just us two, in very much isolated situations. And we tried to, we had the classic line is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so we went on that journey together, really. And so I think there was no doubt that was a benefit to us, having taken on these, day-to-day challenge of just going out and testing ourselves physically in an environment that's going to push us to our limits, but equally maintaining a sense of communication in say, a workout or a kind of mini expedition that we might run before heading out to the Atlantic. And so I think there was probably just that heightened level of collaboration and communication amongst us as a two-man team that without a doubt became so important when we were obviously facing these difficult things. So we could just reflect on the foundation we had built there, I think, which allowed us to be able to think clearly in those moments. But I think there's something you talking about that is interesting, because it takes me forward to where I was a bit later in this experience, and looking back on it and actually asking exactly that question, Tom. Could I have done anything to be better prepared? And what obviously that's something that you're always going to look back on with an experience like this. And when it comes to what I'd probably describe as I saw it as a failure. So I guess I look back with a lot of sort of anxiety and regret around if I could have controlled something differently, or what the opportunities were to have changed the outcome. And I'm not sure, the way that things unfolded, I'm not sure it was possible. We did a lot of things that were positive in reacting to the position we were in, but then equally I was also thinking a lot moving forward about how could we have could we have kind of prevented, what preventative measures could we have had to not end up in that position, which is obviously kind of another part of this experience, I suppose.
So if we now go to the next part of the story, so that's the first race. And everyone watching, after hearing that, you'll now understand why it's so crazy that Max then went and did the exact same race again. So that's kind of the final chapter, if you like. So if we go there in between bit. So
yeah,
the first question is, once you'd spent your 3 weeks on the tanker, got to Brazil, flown home, had a chance to kind of decompress, however you managed to do that. The first question is, what were your biggest kind of takeaways from the experience, from all these things? And then the second one is then, what on earth made you decide, you know what, I'm going to give it another crack?
Yeah. It's a lot of this story, as you say, this, my experience is bookended by a kind of a worst case and a best case scenario, really. And I think that I always look at a lot of the real power of what brought me forward as an individual was everything that happened in between. And I think fundamentally, I came back from that and I was feeling, my thoughts were, I've failed. I was incredibly disappointed. And I was just clinging on to a lot of things that I couldn't control anymore. What had happened. But I was feeling, at times I was feeling really sorry for myself. I just thought, why were we, in that position? We're on for the world record. We were winning the race, and it ended up that the guys behind us, who were just behind us in the race, they ended up breaking the world record. And so for me, I just saw it as this massive, what a shift in a moment where this single rogue wave had completely, turned my future upside down, basically, based on this one moment and everything that happened. And so for me, dealing with all of that, it was very negative in the first few months. But I started to kind of consider, how was I looking at this whole situation and this sense of failure and everything. And there's a great quote by Viktor Frankl that actually just really stayed with me. That basically goes that he says that when you're no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And for me, that was, that really, really did encapsulate everything that I was about, and everything that I was trying to think, trying to do in this moment was, okay, release that control, over what's been, and actually look more internally at how I'm looking at the situation. And for me, I did need to change myself and how my way of thinking. And so I did start to explore how I could think about this in a different way. And I started to see, for me, it was about seeing the opportunity in what I had in front of me. And there were lots of areas of opportunity, the obvious one being the value that I set out to accomplish for myself in taking on this challenge and completing it has now increased significantly if I can make a potential decision to go back. And I did think about this idea of sort of decision-making causality, and how a decision now will impact my next decision, etc. And I knew if I could make a positive step now, a positive decision on this, against this adversity and this challenge, and to kind of take a positive step here, would set me up unbelievably well for all the inevitable future challenges that I would be inevitably experiencing. And so for me, that was powerful enough to start saying, what are the benefits? There's so many benefits for just making the decision to go back and pursuing this race again, without necessarily, giving myself a guarantee of what the outcome might be, because I knew better than anyone that how bad things can get out there. And so I needed to frame it in a certain way. But certainly this idea of sort of decision making, a causality, was something that really pushed me forward. And I also, I think one of the key things was I started to see my worst case scenario experience as a bit of a superpower. And I think, that was massive for me. Was just this sense of, what edge does that give me in terms of experience? What edge do I have now to, one, be successful in getting across, but then two, also be successful in the performance side of taking on this race and against other crews and competitors. And I just think for me, it was, I was someone now that knew exactly how bad things could get. I had replaced all that naivety of 2017, and without a doubt, this person in 2017 was unrecognizable to the person I was in that moment in 2018, having come back, because I had that naivety replaced by first-hand experience of what could go, what can really go wrong. And I think that there was a real sense of how uncertainty of this sort of race can take away your sense of control. And I think that I felt like I could utilize my experience to gain, increase my sense of control, and certainly realize that ignorance is not a strategy for this race. And I think, there was this blissful ignorance about me in 2017. And so I just said to myself, look, I'm going to be the best, the most prepared person that's ever been, who has ever taken on this race, and I'm going to utilize all that experience I had of a worst case and just bottle that up, plan and prepare better than anyone. And I think that one of the things that I was thinking about was that that's basically what the value that delivered, that shift of mindset, of changing my way of thinking about the race, really looking at it way more critically. And just thinking to myself, how can I actually better prepare? No one had ever had a fire on board their boat before we did. So how can I think in a way which is going to explore a breadth of outcomes that I can be ready for, and a breadth of scenarios that I can be ready for? And I think that, for me, that was a massive shift in my way of thinking, and certainly the value, was really in kind of the types of conversations I began to have with myself about how I could prepare for it. And so it was a fascinating period, but that really allowed me to bounce back, I think, and really start to think about a positive step. And I did make a decision 12 months on. Well, it was actually probably sooner than that, about 6 to 12 months on. I was pretty certain by that point that I was going to go back, and made the official decision about a year on from the capsize itself that I was going to go back and take on the race again.
Right, and it's funny because there's a really nice lesson in there, and I used the word failure at the start to describe the first race, and you used yourself, and I did it on purpose because actually when you talk about it, how you've just spoken about it, and how actually you've used that experience as you say, as a superpower, So that's your edge. The experience is what gives you now the ability to prepare, to plan, to train, all these things. In many ways, you look at that first period and it's not a failure at all, because actually that experience is what then has allowed you now to break a world record, and has changed your mindset to give you the outlook you have. And it's, I think in a lot of things in life, being able to view things in that, through that lens of saying, okay, something's gone wrong, actually what can I learn from it? Because, you know, Tommy and I are firm believers that a mistake or something going wrong is the ultimate learning experience. You'll never learn anything more than when things go wrong. If things go well the whole time, obviously you'll learn, you'll get better. But it's a very kind of, you get to a point and you kind of just plateau. Whereas when things go, you almost need that dip to be able to then kind of spike back up. And everything you're saying there is exactly that, of saying, well, actually, no, this isn't a failure. This is, I'm going to learn from this. I'm going to make sure. And that's your mindset, going, I'm not going to let this be a failure. I'm going to figure out actually what happened so I can be better going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably on mute.
Sorry, the Zoom. Just to add to that point, I think it's all about, your ability to frame it. You know, Will, I know we talk about, as you said, at work a lot about using learnings and experiences to improve and to learn, for lack of a better word, but actually identifying it as a superpower, I think, would be a really poignant way for people to find things that resonate in their own lives. We talk about a lot with incredible stories. You know, you take the Atlantic out of your story and look at those tangibles to help to use that as you know, give people the ability to go, actually, this could be my superpower. I've really struggled with this, but this is my superpower, as opposed to what can I learn from? You know, sometimes the word learn, it's difficult to always attach to, but I really think that the superpower is such an amazing way that you sort of use that reframing to help you. And we're going to get to the exciting third part of the story, to that world record.
Yeah, exactly. So no, thanks. And I think that was, you know, that was the thing. It ended up, so at this point I was adamant I was going to go back and take it on again. It was interesting in itself. Me and Chris had, you know, obviously had spent, you know, a lot of time, it spoke a lot in that period, but we hadn't addressed specifically these things. I think we needed a period of kind of decompressing from the experience. But I was thinking about it every day, about this thought of going back. And for Chris, he hadn't gone on that same sort of journey, and he was becoming much more comfortable with what he had experienced already as being value for him to move forward with. And as you say, it's a massive commitment to take 2 years out of your life to really kind of pursue an endeavor like this. And so for him, it wasn't the right moment to start thinking about going back. And for me, I was adamant it was, you know, the right thing. So we diverged, but just kind of, you know, serendipitously, Dave was now finishing up his rugby career and was looking for kind of his next challenge, and we ended up coming together and having a discussion, and he was ready to kind of come full circle on that initial decision back in 2015. And I think, you know, certainly one of the things that we were moving forward with this was this, you know, this broadened vision of both the opportunities but also the threats, and all the different scenarios that could happen in this race. Definitely empowered our decision making and planning right the way through that kind of that preparation process. And I think that, you know, certainly the sort of things that we were trying to do, I think I've just thought about this, and what I was trying to think around is really what I'm trying to achieve is, you know, an ability to be prepared for, you know, to be prepared for any eventuality, and that's not just in kind of planning and process, but it's also, you know, it's a way of thinking. And so, yeah, we moved forward to the start line, and we got to the start line. We ran another campaign to raise the money. Obviously, we had that we couldn't use the same boat because that was at the bottom of the Atlantic. So we ended up bringing, got some kind of more funding, more sponsorship, more partners, got back to the race start, and set off on the 12th of December 2019. And it was again, I remember that first day, they told us it was going to be a fast start, and I thought to myself, oh, here we go again. Like, but to be honest, you know, I was so ready to just capitalize on it and take advantage of it, and really just, you know, take these opportunities if it was going to be a fast start. So we went out there. We had a crazy first couple of days. And as the race progressed, we knew we wanted to start fast. So we went out really hot out the gate, established a lead in the race, and then knew that we could obviously defend that, but build on that each day. And we found ourselves being really successful in the way that we were operating on board that boat, the way we were pushing, the way we were looking after ourselves physically, mentally, looking after the boats and our strategy in terms of direction and navigation. And we ended up getting to kind of the back end of the race and realizing that by about New Year, we had established a 200-mile lead on our nearest competitors. Then the weather started to come in and change. We had a couple of absolute days as flat as a pancake, had to just row through mud basically. But then we got this quite fast weather that started coming in at the back end. And as it started to build, it basically just became very similar conditions to 2017. And that was a whole different challenge in itself for me mentally to kind of cope with this extra input of all those memories coming back about what it's like to be out there in those sorts of conditions. But it did add some serious speed to what we could do, and we ended up rowing, deciding that we could push really hard in this last sort of 10 days of the race. And very quickly we realized that we were actually on track to potentially get close to the world record. And in that final 10 days we covered close to 1,000 miles, close to 100 miles a day, rowing together as much as possible. We rowed around 18 hours each a day in those closing stages, and absolutely emptying the tank, and we had to push to get close to the record. We knew it was going to be close. And it ended up coming down to, in the final basically in the final day, we had to row 14 hours straight together to basically get ourselves close to this record. And even in the last few hours, it was touch and go. And we had this ridiculous sprint finish around the corner of Antigua Island to get into English Harbour, which is the finish, where we were leaving everything out there. I mean, after 37 days of rowing, we now needed to do a 2-hour sprint, which wasn't top of the list on what we wanted to do, but we did completely empty the tank, and you can see that in some of the photos that were taken of us at the time. They're hardly flattering, but we pulled ourselves across the finish line. And I remember just turning and saying, "Have we done it?" to this one of the support boats, and they said, "Yeah." And we had actually broken the world record, by 14 minutes, which is in 37 days is completely absurd. But obviously it was, we needed to just push everything that we had in the last 10 days to make it happen, and to come in under the record, and to be the fastest pair ever, was a pretty extraordinary way to close that chapter.
Yeah, I mean, it's just remarkable, really, to say that I know we spent the majority of this conversation for obvious reasons on the first race, and to go from that to then breaking the world record, and two years later, sorry, wasn't it? It was a 2-year.
Yeah, exactly 2 years. Exactly, it was. Yeah, I remember. I don't know the days exactly, but I did count the days from like the capsize day to the world standing on the world record, the line as a world record holder, and it was like 730 something. But yeah. Quite significant days for sure. Yeah,
it's nuts. It's absolutely incredible, and I suppose a nice way to start to kind of round this off then would be looking back on the journey as a whole. So going from pre-first race Max, who knew nothing about rowing, ocean rowing, to now kind of where you are today and being a world record holder for the fastest pair ever to cross the Atlantic. And this is probably a bit of a kind of finger in the air answer I'm going to be looking for. What would you say is the biggest learning or the biggest change you've gone through in that period of 4 or 5 years or whatever it is?
Yeah, I think it's if I'm going to, I mean, again, yeah, you said a finger in the air answer. This is going to be quite blue sky thinking as well. I genuinely feel like it's the power of individual decisions. Okay. So, and I think that obviously that's quite broad, but I just look at my experience all the way through, and I think people use words like, obviously there are words out there which can potentially be linked to my experience, others' experiences, and in certain sort of what you might describe as a comeback story. This sense of maybe resilience, and what that means is obviously a broad term. But I think if I'm really being specific, and I've thought about this a lot, I've thought about what resilience is a lot, over the last few years for sure. And I think that for me, I look back at my experience and say, well, what is it really defined by? It's defined by a sequence of bold, courageous decision making under different pressures. And I think that, whether that's the pressure, I think I've thought of it in two parts. There's the sort of the ability to make decisions with sort of thinking clearly in the present. So those are those things about understanding what you can control in certain kind of crises situations. And that's the sort of the ability to act and react against things that are unfolding in the moment. And then there's also this sense of thinking more into the long term and thinking critically about how a decision now would impact the future and what you can do now to impact that future. And I think that, and that's an ability to plan. And I just think that kind of, for me, that's what my experience is defined by. It's defined by that sort of decision-making edge of understanding about the power of each of those decisions and what those, what outcome I can drive through a certain decision. So, I mean, again, I hope that's not too broad, but I do really feel like that defines what I've been through, is this sense of being a variety of different crossroads, having a variety of options to try and identify what the kind of the positive right step forward is, whether it's from a kind of survival perspective or whether it's from a sort of positive future focused perspective in the long term. And I think for me, I was able to achieve that, and that's why I ended up with this this fairy tale finish. Was because I was taking those difficult decisions, but certainly ones which really do define people's paths.
Yeah, and I think everything we're about is taking these tangible learnings from someone else's experience and kind of repackaging, reapplying. And I think that being your one big learning and change is hugely applicable to anyone. And it's, as you say, just spending the time thinking about these decisions. And I think you said decision causality you mentioned earlier on, and how this decision is going to impact the next decision, which is going to impact, but think about it in a really positive way. So not thinking about, oh, if I do that, that's going to mean that this is going to be really bad. That's actually going and flipping it and saying, okay, if I do this, it means I can get there. And if I get there, it means I can go here. And I think that's a hugely tangible thing to take away from your story. And actually, as you say, in doing that, you definitely build resilience in it, because you do then end up going from that positive starting point. They are bolder decisions. They are, and the bolder decisions you make, the more you're going to get out of them in the long run. So that's you say kind of blue sky thinking, but I think actually to what was an even more vague question, you've done quite well to come up with that. I think it's a brilliant takeaway.
Thank you.
So Tommy, you got anything else you want to add before we start to wrap up?
No, I mean, I had one question a couple of minutes ago, but I really enjoyed where you boys went with the sky and all that. So I sort of let it go, but it might be worth sort of just touching upon. I'm conscious that there's a lot of self-talk and I mean, for anyone who's sat in a rowing machine, it requires a hell of a lot of self-talk, let alone being out to sea. When you sort of work together, you spoke about looking after yourselves physically and mentally. Now that happened as individuals, but how did you do that as a team? Were you sort of coaching each other, or was there a bit of a, I'm sure there were moments when you both really fatigued and almost needed a hard talking to? What did that look like?
Yeah. I think that there's a tendency sometimes with these ocean races, which where people try and focus on structure, and they try and focus on routine. I think obviously it's a common reflection to kind of feel that a routine has a lot of power and benefit for anyone, and I think that's absolutely right. But I think sometimes these things can be too structured, and I think that one of the things that me and Dave to give you an idea, a crew might be looking to go and do this race and think around, right, we're going to do 2 hours on, 2 hours off until the finish. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to sleep in these periods, and we're going to, this is going to be the structure of our day. And we're going to just operate on a level which maintains that structure and routine right the way through. I think one of the things that me and Dave were pretty clear on, I think equally, there's also these little touch points like, okay, you give someone, say you're rowing for 2 hours and someone's sleeping, you've got to give them a call 5 minutes before you end your shift and make sure that they get 5 minutes to be ready, and they've got to be ready to go bang on the hour to come out and do their 2 hour shift to make sure that everyone's putting their weight. I think me and Dave looked at it like, this is an extraordinary challenge physically and mentally. We're going to have good days and bad days, good moments and bad moments. And the most important thing is to be understanding of the fact that the other person is going to be fluctuating, and it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster. So you've got to manage, yes, the structure's good, the routine's good, and those rules are, the rules don't need to be written in stone. And I think that we were really good at implementing this level of flexibility around our day-to-day, which very much was utilized not only in our structure and routine on allowing someone an extra 5 minutes to get ready for their next shift, allowing some flexibility on the way in which we were structuring our days, but then equally I think there was a lot of stuff of reacting to changes in conditions and being able to capitalize on those. So instead of, if we saw some changing conditions, we knew that we would have to change our shift structure so that maybe we were rowing more together or less together, depending on the weather. And so that flexibility, I think, really helped us look after each other, because we were, rather than feeling building conflict around those frictions of, okay, well, I don't feel like Dave's had an extra 10 minutes, Dave's still sleeping in the cabin, I called him 10 minutes ago, or vice versa, or someone's being a bit emotionally seems a little bit off, and they're not communicating very well. It's just that level of understanding and building in that flexibility, I think, for us that really allowed us to react to changes in conditions and capitalize on things, but then equally not allow small issues to become big issues. And I think that those things made us really look after each other in exactly the right way.
Awesome.
Great answer.
So if we go back to the very start of this conversation, the name for your business, Rogue Wave Scenarios, now becomes very apparent and understandable. So if you want to, can you tell people, if people want to find out more about you, what you're doing, do you want to let people know? I'll give you an opportunity to have a little plug. Let people know
appreciate
that.
So as I mentioned, it's Rogue Wave Scenarios. I'm sure everyone can kind of understand where that's come from now. I mean, to give a bit of extra emphasis on where that came from, I think dissecting my own experience, trying to understand what resilience is from a personal perspective. For me, it came down to two things. It was an ability to have clarity in the present. So that's the clear thinking, the ability to react and respond to kind of crisis situations, and equally the ability to think critically about the future. And those two things for me, that clarity of the present, criticality of the future, really defines resilience from my perspective. And I think it's I've described it as a really sort of dynamic decision-making edge, if you can achieve those two things. And at Rogue Wave Scenarios, we call it a storm mentality, because it helps you navigate those storms that you're in, and that's a personal thing as well, but equally helps you to prepare for everything that's to come as well. And so our focus is to help others to navigate their own kind of uncertain environments that they operate in, and so really I think one of the ways I'll probably describe it is just to enable people to confront the future on their own terms. And I think that kind of sums up what we're trying to do with scenario planning workshops. And you can find us very simply at www.roguewavescenarios.com, and there's a bit more about the stuff that we're doing at the moment on there. Feel free to anyone who wants to reach out, have a chat anytime, then I'm open to that. But we're just at the start of our journey, but I think it's great to be able to have so effectively and quickly managed to sort of convert a lot of what I feel is, what my experience is into, what I hope is and really truly believe is value for others.
Awesome. Well, we will be doing a lot more bits together anyway, so everyone keep your eyes peeled for that. But mate, it's as I say, Tommy and I've heard it once already. I'd argue hearing it again has probably made it even more powerful. And really, so thank you very much for being so open and sharing it all with us. I'm sure lots of people are going to take a huge amount away from it. So yeah, a massive thank you from us.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, and thanks to everyone for listening as well. Appreciate it.